Welcome to the Duck Dive. Today, we're going to shift gears a bit, look less at history itself and more at political mechanics. We're diving deep into the run-up to the 2003 Iraq War, but importantly, through a really specific lens, securitization theory. So for you listening, the mission here is to get a grip on how something, in this case, Saddam Hussein's Iraq, gets deliberately taken out of normal politics and framed, successfully, as this urgent existential threat. We're using the Bush administration's own words, based on a lot of research, to kind of map out that playbook.
Exactly. And to do that, we're looking really closely at a specific window of time. It's the 18 months, basically, from the shock of 9/11, September 2001, right up to March 19th, 2003, the day the invasion actually started.
Right.
And the core of this analysis, it comes from a really detailed look at 85 specific speeches by President George W. Bush during that period.
Right. So the goal isn't just that the war happened. We know that. It's about the exact words, the arguments, the whole context that let the administration justify things way outside the normal political rulebook. Securitization, it's almost like pulling the emergency brake on the usual democratic process. Maybe let's define that theory properly first.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. Securitization theory comes out of the Copenhagen School. It basically maps how issues get treated in public life. So, most things start off non-politicized. The government isn't really dealing with them.
Okay.
Then they can become politicized. Now they're part of public debate, policy discussions, resource arguments, that kind of thing.
Standard political stuff.
Right. But the top level, the really critical one, is securitized. This is when an issue gets framed as an existential threat, like a threat to the very survival of a community or a nation. And the key thing is, if you successfully label something an existential threat, it's seen as justifying, even demanding, extraordinary measures.
Extraordinary measures,
Meaning actions that bypass or just plain break the normal rules. Standard political procedures, democratic debate. Once something's securitized, the talking kind of stops, and action is seen as the only option immediately.
Wow. Okay. The stakes are incredibly high then. So in this Iraq case, who played what role? Let's break that down. We start with the securitizing actor. That's the one declaring the emergency, right? And that was clearly the Bush administration, with President Bush himself being the main voice out front.
Definitely. Then you've got the functional actor. Now, this is interesting. The study points to the media, TV, newspapers, radio. They were the ones amplifying the message, getting it out there. They played a huge part in just transmitting the information.
Okay, but wait. The study is careful not to call the media the securitizing actor. It says we can't be sure about their intent. That seems like a really important point.
It is crucial. The distinction is intent.
Yeah.
The media might have helped spread the fear, maybe chasing ratings or, the story.
Right.
But the study argues their primary goal wasn't necessarily convincing people to ditch normal procedures. That specific intent, that push for extraordinary measures, has to come from the securitizing actor, in this case, the administration.
Got it. Okay, that makes sense. Next up, the referent object. What exactly was supposedly under threat?
The administration was actually pretty strategic here. They used 3 levels, often at the same time. So at the micro level, individuals, they talked about threats to people in Western countries, especially Americans, obviously,
Right.
but also, significantly, threats to the Iraqi people themselves under Saddam.
Ah, the liberation angle, too.
Exactly. Then the middle level, this was probably the most powerful for getting U.S. support, the threat to the United States and its allies. Post 9/11, that argument landed hard, and the data shows it cited in 55 of those 85 speeches. It brought the threat right home.
And then, to give it that global weight, the macro level, threatening world peace, regional stability, that showed up in 41 speeches.
Yeah, so by hitting all 3 individual, national, international, they made it feel like this massive, unavoidable emergency. Nobody was safe.
And finally, you need someone to convince the audience.
Right. You need moral support. That's the general public, both in the U.S. and ideally internationally. They need to believe action is right, and you need formal support. That means institutions with power. Critically, the U.S. Congress, who had to authorize force, and, well, arguably the UN Security Council, though that's more complicated.
Okay, let's dig into Section 2 now, because context, as you said, is key. Securitization doesn't happen in a vacuum. The study's really clear. 9/11 was this vital contextual role. It created this background hum of, well, fear and insecurity.
Absolutely. People were already feeling vulnerable, already thinking about hidden threats that could strike anywhere. That makes an audience much more receptive.
And receptive to certain ways of framing things, like historical parallels.
Exactly. There are these 2 big historical analogies sort of battling it out in people's minds at the time. First, you have the Munich analogy. The lesson from Chamberlain appeasing Hitler in 1938.
Don't appease dictators.
Right. The argument is you have to stop them early before they get stronger. And this idea felt, well, relevant. Think about the first Gulf War, seen as a success, right? Pushing Iraq out of Kuwait. Plus, people remembered the failures to stop genocides in Rwanda and Bosnia in the 90s. There was this feeling of never again, that intervention was sometimes morally required.
Okay, so that's the act now analogy. What was the counter?
The Vietnam analogy, the big one. The fear of getting stuck in another long, bloody, costly war that achieves nothing or worse. The ghost of that quagmire.
So why did Munich seem to win out over Vietnam in this case?
Well, the study suggests a couple of things. The Gulf War felt like recent proof that intervention could work against Iraq. And frankly, enough time had passed since Vietnam. It wasn't quite as raw in the public memory. So yeah, Munich had the edge rhetorically when it came to Iraq.
And then there's the whole WMD issue. That wasn't a new fear, was it?
Not at all. There was this deep-seated, almost gut-level fear of weapons of mass destruction. People grew up with Cold War anxieties, the Cuban Missile Crisis.
The freaking cover drills.
Yeah, exactly. Fear of nuclear Armageddon was baked in. And Hollywood didn't hurt either, reinforcing those images.
So the administration didn't have to create that fear from scratch.
No, they just had to tap into it, connect Saddam Hussein to that existing sensitivity about, the mushroom cloud. Pop culture had kind of prepped the audience.
And one last piece of context, the study mentions Afghanistan.
Right. The initial phase of the Afghanistan war, kicking out the Taliban, seemed relatively quick and successful at the time.
Yeah.
That created this sense, maybe a bit oversimplified, but a sense that U.S. military action could be clean, decisive, effective.
A kind of proof of concept?
Yeah, sort of. It probably made the American public think, okay, we did it there, maybe we could do it in Iraq too.
Yeah.
Made them more willing to consider another intervention.
Okay, this is where it gets really fascinating. Section 3. The actual arguments, the specific things said in the speeches. The study went through all 85 of them, tracking the points being made. What did they find?
Well, what's really striking, and maybe counters some common narratives that focus purely on, say, al-Qaeda links, the single biggest, most frequent reference point was overwhelmingly Iraq and weapons of mass destruction, WMD. That was the core argument driving the sense of urgency.
Just how dominant was it? Give us the numbers.
The numbers are pretty stark. President Bush mentioned Iraq either having WMDs or trying to produce them in 77 out of the 85 speeches analyzed.
Wow, that's almost every single one.
It's relentless, a
Yeah.
clear focus. And to underline the danger, they didn't just say he had them, they talked about his willingness to use them. His past use, Halabja, the Iran-Iraq war that came up in 40 speeches.
So, establish possession, establish intent. What else?
The impossibility of trusting him. This was key to bypassing the UN route.
Right, if inspections could work, why the rush?
Exactly. So they hammered on Saddam's history of lying, cheating, obstructing UN inspectors. That point was made in 55 out of 85 speeches. The message was, diplomacy is useless, inspections won't work, trust is impossible. Therefore, extraordinary measures are the only option left.
And just to really ramp up the fear, they mentioned the scariest WMD of all.
The nuclear threat.
Yeah.
The specific idea that Saddam was close, maybe within a year, of getting a nuclear bomb that was brought up in 20 speeches, that's invoking the ultimate existential fear.
Okay, so WMD was number one. What was the other major pillar?
The second big one was terrorist connections. This was strategically brilliant in a way because it linked Iraq to the global war on terror, which was already fully securitized after 9/11.
Piggybacking on existing fear.
Pretty much. They talked about Iraq having links to terrorist groups, not necessarily al-Qaeda, just terrorism in general in 39 speeches. They did specifically link Saddam to al-Qaeda, or sometimes more vaguely to 9/11 itself, in 15 speeches.
Which was controversial even then.
Highly controversial, yes. But the real kicker, the argument that fused the two biggest fears, was the idea of Saddam giving WMD to terrorists. That nightmare scenario, the world's worst weapons in the hands of the world's worst people, appeared in 26 speeches. Maximum perceived threat.
So WMD and terror were the big two drivers of the emergency. But they didn't stop there, did they? They also painted the regime itself as inherently evil.
Right, you needed the moral dimension, too. Make the regime seem not just dangerous, but fundamentally wicked. So, arguments about Saddam's hostility towards America and Americans came up 55 times, making it personal. And Saddam himself was frequently attacked personally, called evil, a tyrant, a dictator in 45 speeches.
And then the human rights angle, protecting the Iraqi people.
Yeah, that was important too. They highlighted the regime's brutality, stories of torture, rape, executions, that kind of horrific detail in 27 speeches. This framed intervention partly as a liberation, protecting the Iraqi people themselves, and broadened the justification, you know, protecting us and them.
Let's talk timing. When did this rhetorical push really happen?
The analysis shows two distinct peaks in the intensity of these securitizing efforts. The first peak was around September-October 2002. Think about the timing. It's the first anniversary of 9/11, so emotions are high.
Right.
It also lined up perfectly with Congress debating and voting on the resolution to authorize force. And the midterm elections were happening in November, too. Very politically strategic timing.
Okay, and the second peak?
That came later, a really intense burst of rhetoric in January 2003, right before the invasion kicked off in March. And what's really telling about this second peak is that it happened even though the UN weapons inspectors, who were actually back in Iraq by then.
They weren't finding anything concrete.
Exactly.
Mm.
They weren't finding the smoking gun WMDs.
Yeah.
But the rhetoric intensified anyway, pushing towards intervention regardless. It shows how determined the securitizing actor was.
Okay, so we've looked at the theory, the actors, the context, the specific arguments, the timing. Now, the big question, did it work? Was the securitization of Iraq successful? How do we even measure that?
Well, the study uses two main ways to gauge success. First, audience acceptance. Did enough of the key audience buy the argument? Did they reach a critical mass? And the answer there seems to be largely yes, at least domestically.
How so?
Well, Congress gave formal approval pretty decisively. The Senate voted 77-23 for the war resolution. The House was 296-133. Strong majorities.
And the public?
The U.S. public provided that crucial moral support. Polls from February 2003, right before the invasion, showed something like 77% support for military action. That's huge.
So domestically, they got the green light. What about internationally? That was always stickier.
It was. International support was much weaker, definitely debatable. You had major allies like France and Germany strongly opposed, and of course, no final explicit authorization for the UN Security Council.
But the administration went ahead anyway.
They did. They formed the Coalition of the Willing, basically bypassed the UNSC opposition, and argued they had enough legitimacy. So even with shaky international backing, they got the support they needed to act.
Okay, so audience acceptance, largely yes. What's the second measure of success?
The second framework is the use of extraordinary measures. Did the securitizing actor actually succeed in breaking the normal rules? And here, the answer is an undeniable yes. The invasion itself was the extraordinary measure.
Going to war without that clear UN Security Council mandate.
Precisely. Choosing military intervention, especially without that final UN stamp of approval, was a fundamental break from established international political norms. It was the ultimate act outside normal politics.
So pulling it all together, the study concludes that yes, at that specific moment, the securitization of Iraq was successful. The administration persuaded the critical audiences, Congress, the U.S. public, that an existential threat was real and immediate, which justified breaking the rules.
Exactly. The rhetorical strategy worked in achieving its immediate political goal, enabling military action. But, and this is the crucial takeaway perhaps, the analysis shows just how potent these securitization tools are, and potentially how dangerous. Because the success was immediate, but the long-term consequences. Well, the study points out the estimated 1 million Iraqi deaths in the war and its aftermath, the massive regional instability,
Uprise of ISIS.
which emerged directly from that chaos, yes.
So it leaves us, and you, the listener, with a really heavy final thought, doesn't it?
It does. If a securitization process works, if it successfully convinces people to break the rules and take drastic action, but it turns out the premise, the existential threat itself, wasn't actually accurate, what are the true long-term costs of that kind of political success? What happens when the emergency wasn't real, but the emergency measures were?